Well, it's so wonderful to see so many of you here, and it makes me think that feminism is alive and well, and living at UCL and Leeds, and everywhere else. And so it's incredibly gratifying to see that such a group has come to hear what I'm sure is going to be an extraordinary presentation. For me, it's a particular pleasure to welcome Griselda Pollock here. I was just working it out, and I think I've been thinking with and in relation to and alongside Griselda for nearly 30 years now, from from the time that I was a PhD student at the Courtauld Institute and needed to find a sympathetic extra additional bit of supervision that could help me on my way. And I went to Griselda at Leeds, and there began a conversation that I think has been going on for a very long time. And so for me, it's particularly poignant and moving to be able to welcome you here, Griselda, and to say also that I'm sure all of us are so incredibly indebted to the extraordinary range of work that Griselda has produced over the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 decades, really. Since the 1970s, she's been at the forefront of thinking through the discipline, not only in relation to women and questions of sexuality and gender, but in general as well. And I was looking, Griselda, at the list of publications on your website from Leeds and thinking there really cannot be anybody else around who has produced such an extraordinary range of work. Not only the quantity, but the breadth of the scholarship is really quite extraordinary. I urge you all to go and have a look at it. And I just wanted to mention some of the books that have been really important for me. Some of you will know, but not all of you, that Griselda started off as a scholar of Van Gogh, and her PhD was, in fact, at the Courtauld Institute, was on Van Gogh. And I was very pleased to hear that after all these years, it seems as if the Van Gogh book is soon to come out. So sometimes it takes a long time for ideas to gestate and to come to fruition. And Griselda has published quite a lot on Van Gogh in articles that I'm sure you all know. But the book, which will be forthcoming from Yale University Press, is at least advertised, and we all await that with some degree of expectation. But in addition to that, the work that's really, of course, been so important and so formative for feminist scholarship around women and Impressionism, the work on Mary Cassatt, work in general around modernity and the place of women and femininity in relation to questions around modernity have really been reflected in so many different publications, in Vision and Difference, in Differencing the Canon, in the Mary Cassatt monograph, a whole range of books that I'm sure will be familiar to many of you. But some of the work that's been, for me, really, really important and interesting in the recent years is the work on trauma that Griselda's been doing in relation to the contemporary and thinking through photographs and many, many different media. The work of Bracha Ettinger, I'm just going to say, Ettinger in relation to trauma has been very important to her, thinking always through psychoanalysis, keeping the debate alive around psychoanalysis and the way that we can think with psychoanalysis in relation to the image. The work on concentration cinema was particularly facilitating for me. Some of you will know that book, the work done with Max Silverman at Leeds around thinking about the film of Alain Resnais, Night and Fog. So there's too much to mention, and I'm not going to try and be exhaustive, but just to say that we're so absolutely delighted to welcome you here, and particularly to hear a new genealogy for feminist scholarship, which I'm sure you're going to present to us tonight. Thank you, Griselda.
Thank you, Tamara. Can you all hear me? This is okay, the volume? Okay. I did come thinking I was going to give an informal seminar to a group of people tired at the end of a long day of serious research, only few of people who'd hang around at 6 o'clock in the evening. But somehow this particular topic, which is therefore not about me, but it's about the topic, has got some urgency and obviously has brought you all here. So I'm very, very delighted to be here, and I'm extremely delighted to have the opportunity to share this project with you, which is a very new one for me and taking me in a slightly different direction. And it really is a kind of homage to a person who's going to did homage. You'll see that the genealogy comes in a different way, to Helen Rosenau. And I'm going to start by talking about a very small book. Okay, it's a very small book, right? Not even that's a split extension. But the point is, what is interesting about this very small book is that it raises some extraordinarily large issues, one of which is the fact that there is no image of Helen Rosenau to be found on the entire internet, interweb, World Wide Web, whatever it is that you're going to look for. So I can't, as it were, even present her here. So this book will be the place where we will begin to find her. Now, we're going to start with the object, which is always a very good thing. I'm sure your art historical professors and teachers encourage you to start with objects. The book is only 13 by 19 centimeters. As you can see, that's 5 by 7 inches in old money for those who can't yet calculate metrically. It is paper covered, and rather than being bound, is ring bound in clear plastic. Its small size, its informal binding, hardly conveys a sense of monumental significance. It was quite costly at the price at the time of 5 shillings, which is the equivalent of £15 today. I'm not sure you pay £15 for a black and white ring-bound book. It was published in February 1944 by Isomorph, a small press located at 3 Pittshead Mews, London W1, which is off Park Lane, as you can see, number 1. At this point in the midst of the war, at the point at which the war was soon to end, Isomorph was initiating a series of monographs on science, techniques, sociology, and this one on art. The next texts in the series are announced, as you can see: Electronics in Industry, Perpetual Motion, Origin of Jazz, Primitive Music, Power Jets, Prefabrication in the Building Industry. These are rather strange companions for a book titled Woman in Art, not only at the level of the unlikely bedfellows of either women or art with industry, technology, not music, of course, but since most of the industrial topics appear conventionally so proto-masculine, so much on the side of the industrial and the scientific rather than the imaginative or speculative. So what on earth is this little book doing in this little series, appearing in 1944 as the first in that series? And how did its author, a German Jewish refugee, born rather exotically in Monte Carlo in 1900, come to be writing such a text at this date in such a context? Now, as an aside, because I like following up various things, and this does have a reason, I decided to find out about Geoffrey Bocking, who was going to be the next author of the book on electronics in industry. And I found a rather tragic story. Bocking had worked in secret research laboratories during World War II calibrating radar transmitters. But as a result of not having been in active service, his post-war career did not take off with various commissions, and he became a lecturer in design at Hammersmith College and Corsham School of Art. So he links in some ways to our sort of experience, because I've taught at the Corsham School of Art, so I found another connection. And he presided over the Murad Conference at the Round House in 1968, which was convened to consider the future of art education in Britain. But what is significant is he also, like Helen Rosenau, is an instance of a singular and remarkable figure whose subsequent repute did not match the respect that had led him to being solicited to initiate this unusual publishing venture about issues of clearly immense cultural, technological, and social significance at that moment in wartime Britain. And I found this information on a blog written by his son to witness the tragic fact that Bocking committed suicide in 1969, aged only 50. This is not the fate of the subject of my talk, thank goodness. But at one level, this talk is about the art historian who wrote this little book. It might be read as an attempt to reconfigure a place for Helen Rosenau, born in 1900, who died in 1984, in several histories of art, and specifically, as Tamar has mentioned, in the historiographical landscape of engagements with feminist thought in art. That's on the one hand, we could call that the question of feminist memories, but also the other side of it is in her significance in the studies of the impact of continentally trained art historians on the emergent discipline of art history in Britain during the 1930s and 40s. Now, I have elsewhere written, and at some length, about the uneven and dramatic effect of these university-trained, not always Jewish, but mostly Jewish émigrés, on the study of art history in Britain. And this was published in a handbook called Art History and Visual Studies in Europe, published by Brill and edited by the ever-active Matthew Rampley and a massive trans-European team. Now, that so many continentally trained art historians, Vint, Saxel, Antal, Friedlander, Gombrich, and Gertrude Bing, just to name some of them, that so many of these who had an impact on Britain did so as Jewish exiles, forced into damaging and economically as well as psychologically precarious migration by the Third Reich, also opens another dimension to this little book. Does this little book touch obliquely through its author on these ruptured histories of Jewish modernity and their difficult but important relation to the formation of art history in the 20th century, then and now? It seems to me highly significant that in addition to her role in writing this book on art, Helen Rosenau also wrote as her third publication during the 1940s a book called The Short History of Jewish Art, which was published in 1949, and that she was at the same time researching in the late 1930s the history of the synagogue, which and she would ultimately conclude her entire writing career with the book on the far side here, which is a book on the visions of the temple. We shall meet it again later. So the question in this case of the author of the book, Helen Rosenau, takes us therefore quite deep into this latter territory. I want to explore the relation between her work as an art historian, thinking about modes of analyzing Jewish cultural forms, and the focus of the book, which is my topic tonight, women in art, or woman in art. So we need to ask ourselves, how did the ways that she conceptualized one question of figure and concept, woman, across history, interact with posing the question of the figure and concept of the Jew or the temple across history? What model does she offer that draws so richly from modes of cultural analysis beyond the frontiers of art history in order to participate in what I shall argue is a non-Warburgian, but still sort of Warburgian, implotment of history through the image? But for Rosenau, the image is that which registers historical transformation figuratively. So it's not a tracing of the iconography, it's actually how does history acquire a figurative and a rememberable figuration. Figuration becomes symbolization, and that's the key concept. What is the idea of woman or temple operating between symbol, myth, and fantasy that is materially articulated in visual or architectural forms? Her approach, therefore, has nothing to do with the notion of images of women, but images are instead understood as a constitutive track of projections and interpretations on the symbolic aesthetic level. So what form of art historical, socio-anthropological, or even outrightly sociologically inflected thinking makes the posing of the questions Rosenau posed possible or necessary at specific points in history? And what about the moments of their formulation and the fate of the books that carry those formulations? And does the book, in a sense, flash up before us now the moment of recognition that its genesis prepared, while reminding us that something terrible has happened, that we have to recuperate it now? So my questions are, what kind of thinking made it possible to pose the subject, woman in art, in 1940, and it appeared in 1944, and what is specific about the conceptual framework in which it was posed at that date by this scholar? That is to say, she was a historically situated researcher. Her work was inflected, willingly, knowingly, by conditions of difference and possibility in equal proportions, while working in a culture that hardly had any art historical culture at that time, almost no institutions in which to find work as an art historian, almost no dedicated publishing houses to produce your work. Let me just remind you that Thames and Hudson, on which so many of us relied at some point in our lives for a publisher, was founded only in 1949 by Walter and Eva Neurath. And even Phaidon, which is the other great book, only really art publisher started as a historical publication in Vienna in 1923, was forced to move to London, but published for 14 years under the auspices of George Allen Unwin, and its major moment was in 1950, when a stray, relatively unemployed research fellow at the Warburg, I think his name was Gombrich, was commissioned by Bella Horowitz to do a survey art history book in English. Story of Art appeared in 1950, and nobody does not know that book in our discipline. So there's just a little interesting thing for you to remind. Isomorph, 1944, Woman in Art, a book of the same intellectual breadth. Silence, but this book has made it. So 1950 was obviously a better date. But the important thing is that the Story of Art appears 6 years after Helen Rosenau's, offering a thematic survey of art. 6 years after Rosenau's book appeared in English, offering a thematic survey of art, which included on its cover the proof of women as artists, as well as offering an affirmation of gender as a category of thought, culture, social and anthropological research. In the 6 years after that, the founding text of positivist, or very bad positivist, I know, exclusionary and what Lucy Rigore would call sexually indifferent art history appeared from this research fellow, who would then emerge as the preeminent public face of art history for the second half of the 20th century. The success of his text blots out what was clearly possible to think, write, and study, as evidenced by Helen Rosenau's book that appeared in 1944. And it's that closeness between those two dates that causes us to have problems. At both existential and political levels, it becomes clear that being an immigrant, a European Jewish, not an Anglican Jewish, and a woman in a still strongly masculinized discipline offered more than substantial challenges throughout Helen Rosenau's working life. Was it in part because of her potential entry into British art history and culture through a book about woman in art, that paralleling her research on Jewishness in art and architecture, that she became, as it were, indecipherable? So we need to push this historical probe deeper into a politics of knowledge that reached from the mid-1940s, when this book appeared, to the mid-1970s. Why, finally, was what Helen Rosenau proposed in this book so completely invisible less than 30 years later? Why was its memory lost by the time my generation found itself compelled, but in ignorance of our predecessors' work and thought, to pose the question of woman in art again in 1970, but so differently? What do we owe, or what do we learn by reconsidering this book, both in the conditions of its own emergence and in the context in which I became compelled to think about it, to think with it, as a question of obliterated memory or recovered memory? Will this fate, I wonder, await our moment of feminist intervention? 30 years from now, will you be assembled, or your descendants assembled, to find about the strange moment when Tamar Garb and Griselda Pollock and Linda Nochlin and many others and Bryony Furr wrote about these things? Are we going to be, is there a lost contact, a disregarded conditions of emergence that will impose illegibility once again? So I find this an urgent thing. So, part 2. The immediate context for this talk falls between a recent bibliographical project and a long-standing friendship. The precipitating factor was a commission to prepare a bibliography for Oxford Online Bibliographies on women and art history. I was somewhat confused. Am I meant to write about women in the history of art, i.e. as artists in the field of art? Or am I meant to write about women in the discipline, women art historians? Or was it asking me to show how women have been represented in art, or how women have worked as art historians? The very confusion of issues became a topic in itself, so I had to change the title and introduce both gender and the discourse through which it had become to be posed in the final quarter of the 20th century. You do have to sign in. I think you even have to pay for this. I didn't realize at the time. So this great labor is only available to subscribing scholars. I first thought I could just run such a bibliography. I mean, who couldn't, okay? Women in art, that's a cinch. Just wander around the room, take a few books off the shelf, get out some bibliographies. There it is. Off you go. No problem. Indeed, the job was meant to do take a few weeks, and for a feminist art historian pretty in touch with the history of this process, it actually ended up being the biggest thing that I had ever done. The project was just vast, and I didn't complete it as I wanted to do. I had to agonizingly watch this process lasting months and months and months. The enormity of my responsibility was matched only by the historiographic pleasure of being given the opportunity to map out the field, to rediscover the shape of all of what we've done, and to do what I could do to reorient what I consider the deeply impoverished narrative, what I call the bad memory, of feminism and the intervention by women about women in both the field and the disciplinary forms. So discussing, as I was wont to do, with my friend Adrian Rivkin, this nightmare into which I had let myself, about which he was not hugely sympathetic, since I'd put myself into it, Adrian dropped the usual small bombshell by casually mentioning that of course, I shouldn't forget that little book by Helen Rosenau, published in 1944. Dutifully, since I do everything that Adrian tells me to do, I found a copy on eBay, and there it came, through the door, my copy. Now, to frame this action and its effect, I need to make a hypertextual swerve to another moment, because we need to go back to the 1990s, a key moment that was short-lived when a new kind of theoretical Jewish cultural studies flashed up briefly, as Tamar will know, upon the British intellectual scene. We thought we were going to make a huge change, and certain books remain unsold as a result of the brevity of this moment. But certain questions then became speakable. Sometimes Jewish studies intersected with feminist studies and art history. So in 1995, Adrian Rivkin, who was then professor of fine art at the University of Leeds, where he had written his famous lost PhD thesis on Ingres with Helen Rosenau's fellow émigré Arnold Nowak, when Adrian came to Leeds and helped us to found the Centre for Jewish Studies, which was linked to the Department of Fine Art and the Centre for Cultural Studies, one of the activities that this Centre for Jewish Studies hosted in 1997 was an exhibition created by Monica Böhm-Duchesne and Vera Grudzinski titled Rubies and Rebels, Jewish Female Identity in Contemporary Jewish Art. It was first shown in London at the Barbican, and it was a hallmark exhibition of that date's brief flirtation with taking Jewish studies seriously in the field of art and culture. And it took place at the intersection of feminist and Jewish studies. But in 1997, the newly appointed Montague Burton Fellow in Jewish Studies at the University of Leeds, the art historian Eva Freumovich, organized an international conference at Leeds called The Portrait of the Artist as a Jewish Woman to coincide with the Leeds exhibition of Rubies and Rebels. Our aim was to undo the identitarian potential of the exhibition by a different kind of exploration of the issues of Jewishness, femininity, and modernity. Now, speaking at the conference was the chair of fine art at the University of Leeds. Just to remind you what University of Leeds was founded, the art history is the second oldest institute for art history in Britain, founded in 1949 by these remarkable people. So Adrian, in his new role, gave a paper that performed this extraordinary, living, moving homage to a modern Jewish thinker, the art historian Helen Rosenau, his one-time MA supervisor during his studies in art history at Manchester University. It was, if you've ever heard Adrian talk, one of his brilliant, unscripted, spoken tour de force that marked us all indelibly. A queer man speaking of the gesture of intellectual hospitality offered by a German Jewish refugee stranded in Manchester's curious and recently founded art history department. Manchester was founded in 1961 as an art history department, although Rosenau had been teaching there since 1951. So here he is talking about stranded in this department, a department in which I too would arrive in 1974 to begin my own full-time career, but 5 years after the Rivkin-Rosenau encounter. All this was personally very moving. But it was also politically intriguing. Those levels of conjunction, queer, feminist, Jewish, historiographical, biographical, were actually possible at that moment, it seemed, only at the University of Leeds. At the conference, Irit Rogoff spoke about the German expressionist poet and painter Elsa Lasker Schuler. Norman Kleeblatt from the Jewish Museum in New York spoke about his recent and challenging exhibition, Too Jewish, on which we have the wonderful Deborah Cass's My Yentl on the cover. I gave a paper exploring modes of Jewish intellectual femininities, from the first ordained rabbi, Regina Jonas, to Gertrude Stein, to Anna Frank, and of course Charlotte Salomon, on whose work I was just beginning to research. We were all searching for ways to create an enriched, critical, transformative exploration of Jewish modernities, art, history, gender, and sexuality, but we were confined in some way to a pre-war moment. What remained in my mind from Adrian's highly personal paper was this. Beyond the affectionate portrait by a former student, I discerned the significance of this man speaking of this woman intellectual. As an older woman, Helen Rosenau emerged in his discourse as more than an intellectual mentor. She was clearly the generous transmitter of her world to a lost young man, opening a door from his enlivening exposure to art history through Edgar Vince lectures during his years at Oxford University to something that linked the great continental intellectual traditions in art history to this moment, something that was inflected by the double perspectives of outsiderness and marginality. Yes, indeed, Jewishness, but remember, of course, that Jewishness for those within its embrace is actually an inside, so intimate that it can become like a family, a world that sometimes has to be forcibly escaped, a little, or shifted, or queered. There is, however, a difference in the kind of outsiderness experienced specifically by intellectual women, when they are caught in fields of multiple marginality, in situations or institutions incapable of doubling or pivoting their own perspectives. It seems that Helen Rosenau was battling not only with academic Britishness, a lack of art history as an established profession or discipline, but with her own marginalization by the fellow emigres, the continental boys, who took the jobs in London, Oxford, and Cambridge, and sent her off to Manchester. I do advertise there's going to be a fantastic program on Manchester. Jeanette Winterson is just going to give you back Radical Manchester, which is starting, I think, on Saturday on the radio. So George Osborne will come to me and say, don't say things about Manchester. It's going to be the powerhouse. Anyway, so how might we negotiate our understanding of the shock of outsider-inflicted exclusion of one of its own on grounds of unconsidered sexual indifference? Now, if you don't know the work of Lucy Ray-Gray, it's extremely important. She points out that it's not that there is sexual difference, but the world that does not acknowledge gender performs sexual indifference, not even allowing the question of differentiations of experience to come into consideration. So I'm using the phrasing of Ray-Gray, who insists on the problem that all centrist discourse fails to think difference, to acknowledge difference, and thus it institutionalizes sexual or ethnic indifference, normalizing its own modes and thus inflicting otherness on those who merely represent human plurality. In his talk, Adrian Rifkin not only introduced Helen Rosenau to the historical and theoretical field the conference was mapping, a field of gender-inflected Jewish studies and Jewish-inflected gender studies around historical art modernities, he was the forging links through his person between the lost and exiled generation we were studying in the conference and the current generation performing that reclamatory study. The difference was that Helen Rosenau was not someone from the pre-war world who died in the tragedy. She overlapped with those us in the room. She came to AH conferences. She addressed the newly born feminists of the 1980s. Now, that moment of the 1997 conference resonates for me with my own current research into educational and intergenerational thinking. I'm trying to work out how to write different genealogies of the histories of feminist thought that do not prey or fall prey, shall we, to the notions of mothers and daughters, to generational hostilities. So I'm turning for my thinking about intergenerational thinking to a fellow displaced woman intellectual, fellow to Rosenau, and German Jewish refugee Hannah Arendt. In 1961, in her collection Between Past and Future, she wrote an essay that is very telling on the crisis in education. And she writes this: "Education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and by the same token to save it from the ruin, which, except for the coming of the new and the young, would be inevitable. And education, too, is where we decide whether we love our children enough not to expel them from our world and leave them to their own devices, nor to strike from their hands their chance of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us, but to prepare them in advance for the task of renewing our common world. There is much to be said about this remarkable thought, but it is the one that resonates most clearly with what I perceive to have been the moment and the relationship that Adrian presented to us that time. Thus, when Adrian reminded me but 2 years ago of Rosenau's little book, I eagerly sought it out to fill the gap in my study of the interrupted trajectory of art historical writing on women in art. This gap yawns apparently between the 1920s and the 1970s. It is one of the extraordinary features of the 20th century. If modernization of gender and gender participation in the modernization process is the very hallmark of modernity, how is it that the histories of modernity, and particularly modern art, came to be written in the very presence of so many women transforming the field of art, that history came to be written completely without them? How did it happen that but 50 years later, there was a generation of art historians trained at some of the prime institutions of art history in the world who had to rediscover something that was still even alive? When I first started being an art historian, many of the artists that I now study were still alive. I could have seen them. I could have met them. I could have gone to their studios. I could have bought their entire archive, but I didn't know to look. So this is the question that haunts me. How do we explain this? It's not a matter of, well, we just had to get a bit of feminism to get it going. It's an erasure. And this is one of the points where we're going to see how Helen Rosenau just straddles that erasure and brings us back to connections. This transmission that marked the person Adrian Rivkin, which he carried as a personal memory, had never been given institutional and discursive identity. Thus, the little book is the monument to both the potential of transmission and what made it impossible in the wider scene. One of the major historiographical challenges for feminist thinking in art creativity is that the cultural revolution of the 20th century, the intellectual revolution of the 1920s, was not preserved, but was, as it were, cut off from those in the 1970s who emerged as orphaned thinkers, products of inflicted amnesia, even while the women thinkers and artists who traversed the emancipatory discourses and cultures of the early 20th century were still alive. So the question is, how do we deal with this gap between the last great encyclopedic studies of women in the beginning of the 20th century and those of recovery? It is in the middle that the little book will find itself. But why did I not know about these admittedly scattered texts that would have served as a bridge? Why was our knowledge of women in art and our capacity to even pose the question so absent in 1970 when Rosenau was still alive? What could explain the nature of the loss of visibility? Given the date of the publication of Women in Art, we have to place it in a framework in order to understand how extraordinary it is. And that framework should not surprise you, because her book belongs in the same generation, the same moment as Simone de Beauvoir's philosophical contribution, The Second Sex, but also to another lost text by another lost scholar, the sociologist Viola Klein, 1908 to 1973, whose remarkable sociological intervention, The Feminine Character, The History of an Ideology, was published in 1946. This latter book, to which I will turn, has been hailed recently as the most important pre-1970 attempt to elaborate a sociological analysis of gender. That was conceivable in philosophy and sociology in the 1940s. And we can't hardly say that people have forgotten Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. They certainly forgot Viola Klein, they certainly forgot Helen Rosenau. So we shall gain on all sides from a reconsideration of the intellectual legacies of Helen Rosenau as thinker and art historian. But we shall also gain some insights into lost threads, interrupted genealogies, and hence misapprehensions about the basis for what at least some of us are doing now under the rubric of feminist and other radicalities. The case study I'm elaborating provisionally today is a contribution to the historiography of art history in Britain during the 20th century and to the prehistory of what self-named itself as feminism when it found itself estranged, if not cut off, from the emancipatory and modernizing early 20th century and mid-20th century incarnations. I wish to argue that Helen Rosenau had arrived at this small book not as an exception from her mainstream research, but at a critical juncture in her new life as a refugee scholar and in relation to the intellectual framework she brought with her, but which had developed from Panofsky iconography to an encounter with the sociology of Karl Mannheim and his sociology of knowledge. So I'm going to go back to my notion of reading the text and relieve you of this rather long preamble so we can actually get down to looking at what Helen Rosenau wrote. So let us begin with the cover. The title of the book is Woman in Art. Woman in Art could certainly pass as an art historical topic along with dogs in art, horses in art, cups of coffee in art. But there are notably in the German language tradition as well as the French traditions many examples such as, so we've got here, right, La Femme dans l'Art, published in 1891, and Die Frau in der Kunst we find in 1902 in Germany, but we find a lot of this kind of book around that time. So you might think it's a topos typical of 19th century art history, which we know acknowledged women as a topic, precisely as part of its colonization of the subject by gender and the production of a society and imaginary divided by gender. The 19th century did think in gender terms and produced something that, in a sense which Denise Riley calls, as it were, the empire of gender, the saturation of every being by their gender. So woman as image or as an artist became part of the allocation of gendered behaviors and spheres to women, however, with the effect that women functioned not as a topic, women functioned as a topic or an object of representation, but never a singularity, never an individual, never a subject. Not humanity as would be conveyed if we talked about man in art, right? Think of that. But she would be precisely the other, the exception, the not man, exiled from singularity and agency, exiled from the freedom and plurality Hannah Arendt would later define as the condition of the human itself. So thus woman in art is an easily recuperable topic, but therefore tracing a consistent thread of the category through time by means of artistic and cultural representations could risk stabilizing the category itself as something transhistorical, as if it pre-existed all forms of representation. That the foundational text of this modern 19th century reminds us of the ideological project to naturalize the historical distillation of gender relations into a form of natural conditions, out of which then, of course, the modernists struggle by disowning gender as anything to think with at all. So how does Rosenau's book into this? So we need to go to the subtitle. This is neither categorical nor art historical. It is a much more sociological ring to it. It moves from to, indicating a possible thesis. Indeed, it might even look like a modernization thesis. It assumes a certain trajectory, not in time, but in substance. It promises to track transformation. Not a given category now, woman thus functions as a signifier or figure or a symbol susceptible to substantial categorical change, from type to personality. So what sociological thesis subtends this proposition? Is it an anthropological speculation that's being mobilized? Historical change is implied, but it's not a historical narrative of development. What methodology can link the sociological imagination to historical thinking about change in the form of figuration? It's clear from the cover of this little book that it does not offer a purely art historical approach with its attention to historical specificity, to difference over time. It's elaborating a more anthropological or sociological tracking of change within a single category, and it's a gender category. Indeed, it is the category that makes gender visible precisely because it stands outside the category of man and human. Now we're going to be a little philological, which is not my usual thing, but I've learned how good it is to do it. The term woman, it originates in Old English as wifman, that morphs into woman and ultimately woman. Wifman means female human, Any of you who are like Mandarin and different languages where you have a term and then you put another term and you get, you inflect the term with a femaleness, it doesn't create a single category, it's an inflection of the human. And the word therefore has the status of a combination of character necessary to inflect a generic word with sexual specificity. Man, M-A-N-N, had the meaning of human. Until following the Norman conquest, its genderless significance was replaced by more specific associations with maleness and replaced the Old English man word ver, or where. The whiff in whiffman also evolved politically from the connotations of just femaleness to narrow down to a notion of social status, a place in the exchanges that consolidate sociality itself. Whiffman becomes wife, a married woman, and thus language indicates a movement that feminist theory consistently proposes as the problem. The shift from the condition of being one of the forms of humanity, a subject amongst subjects, in the feminine, to being a function, assigned a position in the social systems of exchange coded in language: wife, mother, daughter, girl, sister, prostitute, virgin. Let us play with languages a little bit longer. You may be surprised to learn that girl was once a young person of either sex before it acquired its function. So we can go through all of these particular aspects. So woman in art is going to ask us a question about the origins of this word rather than the origins of this entity. Now the words are placed over a trio of figures, repeating frontal, profile, and rear views of a figurine that is 28,000 years old, that was found near the Austrian settlement of Willendorf in 1902, I think. I'll find the date. Massively contested interpretations of this tiny statuette survive. Most feminist researchers try to resist the simplistic eroticizing effects of the highly political titling of this as a Venus figure. All agree that this figurine and many others like it attest to the attribution of symbolic meaning to the figuration of a distinctively mature, sexually defined female body. Woman is not girl or young woman. The fullness of the breast, the swelling of both buttocks and thighs tempt writers into interpretations associating the fullness of highly lighted forms with fertility, rather than considering the visualization of the idea of production. The former fertility being a condition, the latter a kind of work, a site, S-I-G-H-T, as well as an S-I-T-E, of meaning. If we name these figures Venus, we anachronistically eroticize and sexualize figures, which may, according to one scholar, in fact be a figuration of grief. This might explain the gestures of the hands, which are associated with that habit in other pieces, and also it might explain the bowed head, with its highly worked covering. Yet other people have thought some of these figures represent rather like sort of, figurines you find in Catholic churches, diseased bodies rather than imagined idealist types of big-breasted, full-thighed women who were imagined to carry the resources of procreation in their extended pouches. This is itself an interesting and symbolic writing on the human body. Why these elements? And in the light of this, when we see the classical Greek culture become the antithesis by creating a sexless Venus without thighs, waist, or breasts, and most significantly without genitals, which are clearly visible in the ancient Syrian precedents who had pubic hair and labia, we are forced to ask ourselves some profound questions as to the origin of European culture. But my view, this tiny figurine, you see it's another little small thing, was actually created to lie flat, rather like the Cycladic figures, which we all try to make them stand up. They clearly are, I think, grave goods. They clearly are on the axis of death. So when we return to the cover, the almost prehistoric figure is actually presented sculpturally and upright and in the round. It is juxtaposed to a superimposed work created a few years before the publication of this book. So 28,000 years before the Common Era to 1937, and created in one of the most recent modes of art, abstraction, and furthermore created by a sculptor who is a named woman, Barbara Hepworth. The monolith, a single form, is a standing figure, but it has a slight expansion off the flat plane at its upper sections. It is laid in black. because although there are these versions of it, it is laid in black over the faint red figure of the Willendorf statue. And if we are trying to make sense of the trajectory from type to personality, we might be tempted to read the work by Barbara Hepworth as signifying personality. Yet in terms of appearance or as form, the shift between the two works is rather a move from symbolic figuration to symbolic abstraction, in which the potential of making the upright form as potentially gendered is effected with the minimal uses of the slight curving of the silhouettes. But that would suggest a purely formal reading. Somehow these images are on the cover not to mark a stylistic evolution in art, but rather, if I can find my place, a socio-psychic process that art indirectly and aesthetically registers. It does not illustrate it, it articulates it materially and figuratively. This juxtaposition clearly argues visually that we're not in the sphere of iconography. We have not merely moved from mythic figurine to personal portraiture. Rather, we are tracking changes from anonymous grave goods made with unknown archetypes to contemporary abstraction created and known at the point of consumption to be so by a contemporary sculptor who is a woman, in which individual stylistic artistic projects are functioning as repetitions of larger social conditions of the human social organization at the time at which that work is being made. Thus, we have moved from sculpture to sculptor, art being the territory of cultural marking of ideated creation, not as a mere representation of collective belief systems, whatever that is. It's far more likely to be about death than something like fertility. But Kristeva also teaches us the feminine body is the enigmatic and even traumatically unthinking hinge between body and meaning, between life and its signification, and hence between life and death. Hepworth's sculpture, however, adamantly refuses the horizontality of the dead body and insists on the verticality of the living form. As an form of uprightness, it thus signals light, and in its solitariness, the singularity of each life. The slight inclination of the form and the variable thickness as it rises or tapers supplements this characteristic with a totally abstract signification of variability, hence individuality. And to make this visual proposition implies a remarkable understanding by Rosenau of both modernist abstraction with the professional and artistic identity of the maker and the relevance of reading of an abstract sculpture in relation to a much longer history in which form and gender entwined. And this is not about colonizing the primitive, as so much modernist reading of the past was, but for identify how different socio-symbolic ensembles and societies figure what matters to them. It is about evolution not as development, but as adaptation, and hence it is making a historical and indeed a sociological proposition. It is not an art historical proposition, so we have to ask ourselves, where does this method originate? Now, it is my understanding that the research for what became this book was undertaken postdoctorally when Helen Rosenau was on a research project in sociology at the London School of Economics in the year after she completed her third doctoral thesis at the Courtauld Institute in London in 1939. She did her first doctoral thesis on Cologne Cathedral, a second one on design and medieval art, and I haven't been able to work on this particular thesis or find out who else did a PhD at the Courtauld in the late 30s. But this little book is the product of the remarkable British intellectual Fabian Institution, London School of Economics. So how on earth did we get there? Helen Rosenau, I've said, was born in 1900 in Monte Carlo, was privately educated in the Bavarian spa town of Bad Kissingen. She studied art history at many universities, as was the custom at those times, passing through the classes of Heinrich Wölfflin at Munich, Adolf Goldschmidt in Berlin, Paul Clement in Bonn, Owen Panofsky in Hamburg, where she completed her doctoral thesis on the still intact cathedral. I'm just going to show the still intact Cologne Cathedral. That's it, after the bombing of Cologne. But the fact that she was in Hamburg means that she would have been aware of the Warburg Library during this time, It was still there. It was just about to leave when she was going to leave. But being in Hamburg places her at the vital center of new thinking at the limits of art history. Forced to flee to Switzerland, and then she arrived in London, where the British Federation of University Women, say a great hooray for the British Federation of University Women, and we should all join it because they will ultimately help you. They provided her the money to complete her habilitation dissertation, and then she is recorded as studying at the Courtauld to produce this third dissertation. Now this gets interesting because the third dissertation switches from cathedrals to synagogues. Now this is rather fascinating. To be trained by some of the well-known figures of the flourishing German art historical community, most of whom were Jewish, who mostly worked on Christian, medieval, or Renaissance culture, she switches now, and in the context of displacement, she continues work, first of all, the design in medieval architecture, that would enable her, were the nightmare of Nazism short-lived, to return to the expected process of progression in the German university context as a medievalist art historian. Unable to do so, she registers at the newly opened and historically void Courtauld Institute. I am not saying anything against the Courtauld Institute, but it only founded in 1932, and by 1939, it had left London. It was closed for the duration of the war, so it wasn't doing very much at the time. So she created, in the absence, her new topic then announces this wonderfully willful embrace of the Jewish condition of her exile and interrupted career, switching from cathedrals to the history of the synagogue, which will radically expand the historical and geopolitical frame of her investigation into the meaning of building forms that relies as much on archaeology, imagined representations as monumental presence. Most of the great synagogues of the past lost, but of course, it's interesting to note that the most famous of the oldest of the synagogues was discovered in Dura Europos, in the Syrian border. It dates from 244, the critic of the Common Era, but it had been excavated in 1932, so she's absolutely on the cusp of the new discoveries of this work. Now, what made the finds so interesting in Dura Europos is the discovery of figurative wall paintings. Helen Rosenau was swift to take up the challenge of writing this history of architectural form, publishing consistently through the 1930s and 40s on the architectural development of the synagogue. Let's just pause to think of the significance of devoting years of initial exile to the study of so obviously Jewish a topic, and publishing a book on the synagogue's long history in 1940, at the point at which everybody thought the Nazis would invade and overrun Britain. Now, having completed this third work of architectural and cultural history, Rosenau has to find work, and she gets a research post under the supervision of Karl Mannheim, a Hungarian-born sociologist who, by good fortune and academic renown, found a paid position at the LSE. In 1939, however, the LSE is in Cambridge, along with Karl Mannheim. And of course, it's not port, but they are inevitably drinking something in Cambridge. Now, we're going to come to Karl Mannheim, but we're going to go down another little byway because we have to find out about George Peabody Gooch, 1873 to 1968, who wrote the preface to this little book. He's a journalist, a historian, and a politician of the Liberal Party. Elected in 1903, he lost his seat in 1910, but in 1908, voted for the Women's Enfranchisement Bill, so he definitely moves into hero category. He was president of the Historical Association, a peace activist, and the editor of the Left of Centre Contemporary Review between 1911 and 1960. The journal had a role in promoting arts. It published a lot of Holman Hunt's articles in the later 19th century. It's the site of the infamous attack on Rossetti and the Fleshly School of Poetry, if any of you are the students of that particular era. And G.P. Gooch, however, in his introduction, declares quite boldly that Dr. Rosenau's approach is not merely a collection of images of feminine types in chronological order. Her approach is sociological. Her aim is to relate the representation of women in art to their position during various stages through which the Homo sapiens has passed in his long and painful ascent from primitive times to the differentiations and complexities of the 20th century. This sounds a little bit anthropological to me, and being so ideologically inflected with the progressivist interpretation of change. Rosenau is represented as a thinker no less than a narrator of social evolution, and he sees the movement that she's documenting one of the most thrilling in the history of art, and finally that she is going to reevaluate the process, the most significant changes in the modern age from the relatively unfamiliar angle of the history of art. So she is situated outside of the history of art, but using it to plot out some kind of transformation. Now, this might explain the conditions under which the research for this text was undertaken at the LSE under Karl Mannheim. I did not know a lot about Karl Mannheim. I do not know a great deal now, but what I do know, I'm going to share with you. He was born in 1893 in Budapest. He studied in Budapest, Berlin, with Georg Simmel, in Paris, and in Heidelberg. He was a youthful member of the extremely famous circle of the Sonntagskreis in Budapest, which included Georgi Lukács, Friedrich Antal, Béla Balázs. Those of you who do film studies will know how important that is, and of course the founder of the social history of art, Arnold Hauser, later to be a professor at the University of Leeds in the 1950s. To this group of thinkers, several of whom ended up in London in the 1940s, is attributed the foundations of Marxian social histories of art, in Hauser's way, and the sociology of knowledge, the latter associated with Mannheim and his work after 1933, where he was forced into exile. Mannheim is considered significantly not only for his inquiries into epistemology, but the sociological analysis of the very structures of knowledge that he performed by extending the limited concept of ideology, which was represented in Marxist theory as false knowledge or misrepresentation. Thus, going beyond the Marxian concept of a class-specific view of the world, Mannheim embraced as sociologist and later educational theorist the problem that everybody's beliefs, including those of the investigating scholar, are subject to and shaped by the social, political, economic context in which they were situated. Knowledge and its production are thus shaped by factors such as class, age, sexuality, and what we might now call geopolitical and psychosocial situation. He goes further by arguing that knowledge has to be subjectively produced. It cannot become knowledge if you abstract and objectify from life. That does not mean that all knowledge is personally inflected as opposed to being objective. It means that knowing is an act of an existing subject. It is knowing this as a researcher that constitutes what we produce as knowledge rather than as ideology. Knowledge production, he argued, is embodied, located, specific, and that does not mean relative in a chaotic way. And his major work was the publication in 1929 of Ideologie und Utopia, which appeared in his own English revision in 1936. So it's just hot off the press when Rosenau engages with it, although she could do it in German as well. Widely reviewed and much debated, including a review by Hannah Arendt, Mannheim's text was a major intellectual event amongst the Weimar intellectuals of the 1920s and the sociologists worldwide. So truth for Mannheim is existentially bound by being related to life, but that does not make it relativist. Existence signifies historical changeability in contrast to given facts such as life or death, between which existence is lived. And another key point which you will see is so crucial to Rosenau's project is that changes to the organization of any aspects of social existence, including public and private dimensions, alter not only personality in existences, but also therefore the nature of knowledges that is produced of them and the nature of the inscription of those knowledges. Thus, for instance, he'll identify a difference between pre-capitalist systems in which social, cultural, and economic activities are not distilled into separated compartments, but integrate thought, belief, fantasy, and sociality in forms that offer social cohesion, the grounds on which we could study the little women of the Willendorf kind. Whereas the increasing hegemony of the economic sphere in capitalist societies drives the geistig, this space between intellectuality and fantasy or imagination, into separate ideological compartments, while also agitating those compartments to rigorous theorizing, producing the disciplines sociology, philosophy, anthropology, art history. Now, Mannheim's innovative presentation, and this will finally take us to the book, you'll see why it's so important, of the idea that knowledge might be sociologically analyzable process of the production of thought, would now be hospitable to issues that we now name as gender, but then had no name. In this context, we could argue that woman, changed from a given facticity, becomes the product of situated acts of knowing and self-representation. It becomes the term by which difference could itself be considered, itself an ideological element of its own moments. Mannheim would use his Marxism, this idea of totally determined knowledge, against aspects of psychoanalysis, to insist that something like a social unconscious functions as a means of countermanding any ideas of Descartesian autonomy of a reasoning thought subject, arguing that knowledge is the product of the social position and of the fantasy of the knower, shaped in historical change, both counters the ideological positions that foreclose on a politics of knowledge, and also, in the counterform, permits the writer to speak in a situated voice, to claim the product of a reflective use of such position as knowledge. Now, you can see how constantly any of us who've used any kind of thing that deviates from the notion of the abstract forms of disinterested knowledge are always labeled as introducing something extraneous to knowledge. Gender, you're a feminist, you're a socialist, you're a Marxist, you're queer. You should not be messing with knowledge by bringing that in, whereas the Mannheimian position says no knowledge is knowledge unless it is the product of an existing subject. This is, I think, absolutely radical. So I'm going to hurry up a little bit because we need to get there. So this quotation, what have been the effect, so that is a quotation which simply repeats what I've just said, so you can read it while I'm going on. Okay, so the other figure that is around Mannheim at the time, and I won't take too long on this, is Viola Klein, who is going to do a full-blown Mannheimian sociological analysis of a whole range of people writing about femininity through the 19th to 20th century, from Freud to Margaret Mead and others, in order to ask this question, then what have been the effects of their inferior status upon the personality of women? What characteristics have they in common with other suppressed minority groups? And what, therefore, might we understand to be the means of transforming the effects, not of their damaged psyches or failing bodies or natural inclinations to vulnerability, passivity, all the usual range, but actually how you would actually transform this so it becomes part of the emancipatory occupation, and clearly links into this. Now, I'm going to get you now finally to one little final bit of the biography that puts it in, which is just to remind you that the last book that Helen Rosenau published was published by the late lamented Robert Oresco, who was the one who gave us all our first jobs. I wrote my first book for him, I wrote my second book for him, and I was in the process of writing my third book for him when he sold up to a pornographer. And Rosie and I had to steal this book back from pornography, which is why it took so long to come out. But at the same time this book was in production, Helen Rosenau's was that, and that just completely threw me. I could have met her and known her in the offices of Robert Oresco. So we now come quickly to what you've all been very patiently waiting for. What did she actually say? Right, and I can see I'm about to run out of time, but I think it's important to see what she actually said. Probably, but you will see why you cannot understand this book. You won't be able to read it if you haven't had this complex sense of where she actually is able to get this thinking. So when we come to the preface of the book, which I seem to have lost here, she opens by telling us what she's going to do. Show how the closer interrelation exists between the visual arts and society. You might think that's just social history of art, but it's not. To suggest changing attitudes regarding womanhood in the course of human evolution can be tracked. And the third, to consider whether there are to be found any permanent features which repeat themselves in varying social conditions that may be regarded as typically feminine. Oh dear, we're into femininity. But as you know, I'm not afraid of it, coming to it from psychoanalysis, linguistics, and the French. But what is crucial here is that it's only possible to pose that question once you've radically removed the possibility of even imagining a natural source of it. You have to do this work to arrive at the possibility of asking. It is exactly the same history that we now have to do through to this. Now, Mannheim read this, and she says very clearly in her preface, at the same time, it has to be remembered that only from a subjective point of view can the concept of history be realized, and that it is a personal point of view which enables us to grasp the order in a seemingly chaotic sequence of events. This is a perfectly Mannheimian statement of how she's going to do this. Now, the structure of the book is this: 3 thought chapters: wives and lovers, motherhood, and further aspects of creativeness. Oh dear, you say to yourself, this is what I have been waiting for. Did we expect these categories, and are you disappointed? But what does their choice reveal about the approach and the discovery of her research? The structure of the book elaborates exactly what the cover has visually instated, starting with the Willendorp type and ending with Hepworth's individuated artistic practice of abstraction. So what she has to do is to start at the beginning about and say, we know nothing at all about women in the earliest stages of human evolution. The phrase human evolution displaces biological determinism from the start. Whatever happened before culture is unknown and cannot be used as any basis for any deductions. Edmund Gross, the author of an 1896 book on the form of the family, is quoted approvingly arguing that cultural influences are alone responsible and change biological potentialities. So when we do get representations of women, such as the Willendorf Venus, they indicate societies in which women, qua women, i.e. differentiated, were, quote, basically important. And they endowed the mother with the social prestige in the absence of the knowledge of paternity. She will, in her footnotes, quote J.J. Bachhofen, the much more recent Robert Briffaut, on Les Mères, and these oppose their theories of primacy of the mother and woman to Freud's patriarchal totem and taboo. She talks about Fraser of the Golden Bough. She invokes Ruth Benedict, the American anthropologist, and also Gregory Bateson. So this is an incredibly interesting starting point that she has with major contemporary debates in anthropology. And the book she's referencing not only found the basis of current anthropological writing, but she enabled her to identify a gynodynamic character in which veneration and taboos emerged in relation to the cultural idea of the magic manner of the woman through the possession of offspring. Here Rosenau cites the great classical scholar of the ritual school, Jane Harrison, who so influenced Virginia Woolf in her writing in the novel form, and also Abi Warburg in his defining lecture on the serpent ritual. Jane Harrison and fellow ritualist Gilbert Murray argued that art originates in ritual, in actions around emotions, and it was influence rather than rule that constituted women's sphere and prominence, which was exhibited in their massive presence in the material records of the Paleolithic age. So in seeking to set this stage for change, Rosenau both identifies the distribution of influence in agricultural societies and suggests, however, that women's preeminent role in such societies drove their rather hang-about boys to find something to do. So they had to go out, and thus the significance of women turned into the instrument of their potential overthrow by the later patriarchs. Interesting theory. Lacking knowledge of the mechanics of reproduction, women had then claimed their children by ritual acts, instituting patriarchal systems as a result. Now, what Rosenau is making a telling point is that if we are not going to start with David Attenborough type models of how society starts, but we will have to understand the role in the imagination of that time of two basic images, the animal and the nude body. There aren't men, right? So this is a very crucial thing. There are little stick figures who sometimes dance about and hunt, but there are no sculptural inscriptions of this. So what she has created there is an array of sources in anthropology and the studies of the few Paleolithic materials that they had in order to create a vision of a certain social and imaginative order, that she has not started with men but with women, and from that she will follow men and women into relationships. These therefore are not functions. So when you get to the next chapter, Wives and Lovers, she's picking up the anthropological debates around social structures, emotional structures, personal structures, and around this question of marriage, this institution, which is not the natural product of mating, it is the product of the most extraordinary social interventions into the forms of social life. So instead of following David Attenborough and the Natural History program Animalization of Social Relations, Rosenau is suggesting what would appear 5 years later in Levi-Strauss's Elementary Structures of Kinship, the notion that culture is constituted in the creation of marriage, namely in the exchange of women. And in 1976, one of the founding texts, I'm going to have to finish very soon, I know, of feminist theory advanced by queer theorist Gail Rubin, used Levi-Strauss to insist that the production of men and women is as the minimal unit of society, the enforced suppression of women's sexuality and the enforced suppression of men's homosexuality are the joint effects of creating this particular form of a created unit of mutual dependency and difference, thus producing gender and sexual difference. When she comes to look at the question of relationality, it's not constructed in terms of that, but instructed in terms of images we have of what kinds of mutual regard might be inscribed in art by means of transformations of that structure, that constitutive structure, as we pass through the processes of Protestantization and modernization, capitalization, and we'll end rather interestingly with two kind of images in her book. One, the portrait of Sidney and Beatrice Webb, referencing the intellectual companionship and political companionship, and also a Picasso kiss. She then can come to motherhood only at this basis, which has now been freed from being part of marriage. It has been produced as a potential set of relationalities and partnerships, and she will trace it through different cultures to arrive, and this is the point I'm going to want us to finish on, etc. She will then arrive at Paula Modersohn-Becker and Käthe Kollwitz. She will arrive then not at any notion that it is women's destiny to talk about motherhood, but that motherhood is precisely a very complex, socially experienced existential condition of subjectivity, which can be represented either in fantasy, as in the case of Paula Modersohn-Becker, or in relation to the extreme anguish of experiencing the psychological bonds to a child in conditions of radical impoverishment, hunger, starvation, and war. She then says that what men do is much more personal. They don't paint the image, the question of the mother, they paint their own mothers. And I wish I had to say, if only she'd known about Mary Cassatt's wonderful portraits. At the end of the book, she comes to further aspects of creativity. And what is so astonishing is how much she knows. Names of artists that we took a while to rediscover: Anguissola, Gentileschi, Terbush, Lisiewska, Kaufmann, Elizabeth Ney, Marie Laurencin, amongst others. And of course, much more interestingly, in order to ensure there is a much more varied presence at this particular point, she introduces this remarkable artist that I hadn't come across, Renée Saint-Denis, whom she speaks of in terms of her ability to sculpt her own exploration of the forms of what perhaps Jack Halberstein would now call her female masculinity, rather, but certainly the ways in which she would negotiate an image for her own identity and sexuality. And then we end up again in this particularly interesting image of a twosome with a hollow in Barbara Hepworth. And she will conclude by talking, it's in various forms she has to see it in, about Stella Bowen, whose wonderful book, Drawn from Life, was published in 1940, which is an extraordinary image of story of the experience of attempting to be a woman artist at that particular time. So we are coming to a conclusion that, as she says at the very end of the book, and this is the final statement of it, I think this is going to be it, right? But for the evolution to fulfill its promise, the development of individual woman is not enough. It is not only by cooperation and recognition of different personal ways of approach to the social problem of their time that women will be able to contribute fully to the historical process, no longer as a means, but also as an end of human evolution. This is a very Mannheimian proposition, refusing the submission of the individual to the subject of history as in Marxist terms, but equally refusing the individualism of capitalist liberalism. The social production of the self and knowledge requires the production of a social framework for singularity. Rosenau, I suggest, did use art historical knowledge and the figure of the artist and the making of art in its complex interweave with sociological and anthropological resources as they stood in 1939 to 40, to arrive at a formulation that still resonates with and provides a challenge to contemporary feminist thought. The singularity of each woman within a collectivity that is self-created politically out of a recognition of the differences of lived social, economic, and psychological existence. The passage from Hamburg to the Courtauld to modern feminist thinking did not in fact pass via Warburg as I initially thought when first seeing this book and the collection of images. It results from an engagement with the comparable reliance on anthropological thinking, but also on the more political sociological thought, and specifically the sociology of knowledge. It has enormous prescience for exactly the kind of intricate relations between the political and the aesthetic, the historical and the material, the symbolic and the imaginative, that I find myself struggling to configure under the evolution of feminism as a practice of intellectual reflection, social commentary, embodied engagement with inscriptions in, of, and from the feminine. This lengthy lecture has been just a preliminary sketch of the work to be done to recover the intellectual and political legibility of Helen Rosenau's remarkable work, to give her a place in the historical situation and the intellectual formation that lies between the great sort of suffrage moment and the moment of the generation of the 1970s. I hope I have not offered you a recovery, but just a work in progress that opens up many more avenues to research and encourages us to do a very, very close reading of Woman in Art by Helen Rosenau.
Thank you so much, Griselda. That was a veritable archaeological excavation, and I'm sure we're all altered by it. I mean, in a very short lecture, in a way, you have sketched a huge universe, and even though it took an hour and 20 minutes, I feel that it's only the beginning, which is really so extraordinary and so amazingly facilitating.